Hello and welcome to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I'm your host, Adam Conover. On this show, I talk to researchers, academics, and experts about the work they do and why it is so fascinating. You may also know me as the host of Adam Ruins Everything, the TV show, which airs Tuesdays at 10 p.m., 9 p.m. Central on True TV, or you can find clips and full episodes at truetv.com/Adam Ruins Everything and the Watch True TV app. But today on the podcast, we have Kevin Hall. Kevin was on our show, Adam Ruins Weight Loss, where he discussed what happens to people who go on weight loss shows like The Biggest Loser and why it is so difficult to lose weight. And folks, it is really incredibly difficult to do. On the TV episode we do about this, we talk about why almost every method that people use to lose weight, every method that people tell you, hey, if you do this, you're going to lose weight guaranteed, why it's not guaranteed, why almost none of them work consistently for everybody. It's not to say that nobody can lose weight. People do it, but it is so difficult that there is really no way for you to say, hey, I'm going to make this change, I'm going to lose weight guaranteed. And as a result, we need to take that pressure off of ourselves. We need to stop judging ourselves and judging each other based on how much weight we're able to lose and focus instead on just trying to be a little bit better every day and trying to be as healthy as we can for our own benefit. And so what I love about Kevin is that he is a guy on the ground researching this topic. He's a researcher at the National Institute of Health where he investigates how metabolism and the brain adapt in response to a variety of interventions to diet and physical activity and why it is so difficult to lose weight. I am so excited to have Kevin join us today from Bethesda, Maryland. Let's get to the interview. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you're a researcher at the National Institute of Health based in Bethesda, Maryland. That you're doing like big government research on the topic of weight loss and obesity, correct?
Big government research, yeah, sure.
Well, so what I'm curious about is how did you get involved with doing research on contestants from The Biggest Loser?
Right. So, we do these really highly controlled diet studies here at the NIH on people with obesity. And one night after kind of coming home from the lab, I happened to watch an episode of The Biggest Loser to kind of the tail end. And saw these folks stepping on these scales and losing dramatic amounts of weight in apparently very rapid pace. And I couldn't really understand what was going on because it was kind of outside my usual experience. And so I ended up finding the contact information for the show's physician. And therefore, I was able to kind of get him on the phone and ask him what the heck was really going on with these folks, and was he able to measure certain things about how many calories they were burning and those types of things. And after talking with him on a couple of occasions, we decided that we might be able to collaborate and send some folks from the NIH and our collaborators out to Malibu to study a future season of The Biggest Loser, and that happened to be season 8.
That's so funny. So you came home from the lab and you were like, wait, these people are running their own experiment, but it's on TV and there's no scientists there and we got to get some out there.
Exactly.
That's so funny. And what incentive did The Biggest Loser have to let you guys in there? Was it just like, hey, yeah, sure, we want to participate in science, or what?
Well, I can't speak to what the producer's incentive might have been, but the physician in charge of the care of these folks, he was very interested in the science and very interested in better understanding what was happening to these folks. And I think he appears on the show quite regularly and has some sort of influence with the producers, and so was able to kind of allow us to sneak in and study these folks.
Right. So what did you find about the folks on the show?
Yeah, so we recognize pretty early on, just by watching, and everybody who sees the show can see how much exercise these folks are doing, just dramatic amounts of exercise, very strenuous exercise. And there was this notion in the past, and still perpetuated in various health and fitness magazines and websites, that if you were just able to do enough exercise, you could keep your muscle mass and prevent your metabolism from slowing down when you lose weight. And so that was kind of the primary thing that we were interested in, was that these folks were obviously doing this dramatic amount of exercise. Were they able to preserve their muscle and prevent the usual drop in metabolic rate that happens when people experience weight loss, especially at a very rapid rate.
And can you just fill me in on how that works? The lowered metabolic rate. So normally when people lose a lot of weight, their metabolism actually slows, so that they're burning less calories at a resting rate then?
That's right. Yeah. So just laying around resting, how many calories does your body need to sort of just function? And the idea is that as people lose weight, they lose a bit of their muscle as well. And the thought is that as they lose muscle and the sort of lean tissues of the body, that metabolic rate should fall. And so the question that we were asking was, well, what if you don't let the muscle mass decrease because you're able to do enough exercise to actually prevent it or even build it up? And what we saw was actually pretty dramatic slowing of metabolism, despite the fact that they were actually able to relatively preserve their muscle mass.
Wow. So the fitness magazines were wrong. Even though these folks were doing an incredible amount of exercise and losing an incredible amount of weight, their metabolism still slowed dramatically.
Yeah, it slowed much more than even would be expected given the amount of weight loss, which was
Really?
something we call metabolic adaptation. It's just a fancy way of talking about the degree of slowing in excess of what you'd expect based on their new lower body size. So that all happened when these folks were in this weight loss competition. It was a 7-month competition that's televised, and then we sort of decided after that, we kind of expected that most folks would regain some of the weight that they'd lost in the subsequent years. And so eventually we recontacted these folks 6 years later and invited them to the NIH here in Bethesda to better study what happened to them in the intervening period.
I mean, this is sort of what everybody wants to know about reality shows, right? I mean, it's even when you watch The Bachelor, you wonder, okay, well, they get engaged at the end, but does the marriage work out? And we have the exact same question about this show. All right, yeah, this person lost whatever 3 digits of weight on this show. What happened to them afterwards? Is such a question that the shows never answer themselves. So what did you find?
Right. So, we sort of expected that they'd regain some of the weight. Just to kind of give you an idea, the average amount of weight loss in the actual competition part was, something like 130 pounds. So
wow.
It's a huge amount of weight loss over a 7-month period. And then 6 years later, they had, on average, regained about 2/3 of the lost weight. Which isn't unexpected. In fact, they're actually maintaining about a 13% weight loss from where they started. So it's actually pretty good kind of maintenance of weight loss. It just looks bad given how low that they went after this competition. So that part alone wasn't so surprising. And in fact, it was encouraging that they were able to maintain some of that weight loss on average. The surprising part was that the metabolic rate was still just as low as it was at the end of the competition, despite regaining a substantial amount of weight. And that still is somewhat surprising to me. I still can't quite explain it. It seems like something persistent has happened to these folks in terms of their metabolic rate that did not recover, despite the fact that they did recover a lot of the weight that they'd lost.
So it's almost like they did permanent damage to their metabolic rate by being on the show. Is that how you'd put it, or?
Yeah, I don't know if I would call it damage because I don't know. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it. But
fair.
I would say that their metabolic rate is certainly slower and unexpectedly slower than one would expect, given where they started and how much weight that they'd lost and then subsequently regained. And of course, that makes it difficult for them to keep the weight off.
And did you bring these findings back to The Biggest Loser at any point, or?
Well, so for the follow-up study, the physician was not actually a part of the follow-up that 6 years later. So we certainly filled him in on what happened in that 6-year follow-up period, and we basically gave him a copy of the publication that came out.
Did he have any reaction at all, or?
Yeah, I think he was in a similar state of disbelief, going so far as to suggest that there was possibly something wrong with the experiment. He actually wrote a letter to the editor of the journal that that we published the manuscript in, outlining several potential reasons why he thought there might be a flaw in the study, and we responded to those, and we wish we could find some flaw to explain away this effect, because, like I said, we don't have a good explanation of what happened, and we really, did everything we possibly could to try to explain, why did we see this result, and we can't find any obvious explanation.
I'm just curious, the contestants themselves, I mean, how did they feel after this experience, or was there any effect on them in that regard? Because you imagine it would be very it's quite a roller coaster to have that experience, go on TV, lose so much weight publicly, gain most of it back, have your metabolism be changed,
Yeah, no, I mean, these are folks who obviously had tremendous amounts of willpower and were able to stick to this, very low calorie diet during the actual weight loss period for a 7-month time frame, as well as engage in a very large amount of exercise. And in fact, they continue to do a relatively large amount of exercise even to this day. And I think that, they felt before the study and before these results, they felt a real sense of shame and failure that they had regained this weight that they'd so publicly lost. And I think that, by helping them understand what happened to their body from a biology perspective, the physiology of metabolism, it really helped those folks, and hopefully the broader community as a whole, better understand that there are real biological drivers to obesity that resist weight loss, and especially over the long term.
Right. That's the part that I keep coming back to. I mean, obviously the biological effect is really fascinating, but I really love that you said that these people had a lot of willpower, because so much of the conversation we have in our own society about weight loss is that willpower is the key, and you just have to push through, and anyone who's overweight is even if, hey, it's the result of a medical or biological condition, you can overcome it with enough willpower. And I mean, it seems that we're wrong about that. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think there's a bit of a double-edged sword. So first of all, I completely agree that there's a large group of people who especially comment on websites and in the comment posts and whatnot who are lean. They've never been obese in their life, and they like to take credit for that as some sort of moral superiority.
Right.
But what we know is that heritability of body size and obesity has a huge genetic component. Obesity is almost as heritable as height. We all kind of recognize that people with tall parents tend to have taller children.
Yep.
But most people don't recognize that when you actually do the math, the heritability of body mass index, one of the indices that we use to quantify obesity, is almost as heritable as height. So there's
Really?
there's a huge genetic component to this. That doesn't mean that you can't change your body weight, but you have to do so by making persistent and continuous changes in your lifestyle in order to do this. And it means that the folks who are genetically most susceptible to gaining body weight are probably not going to be the most skinny people that right? Despite all of the willpower in the world, they can maybe not be as heavy as they would be otherwise, but they're probably not going to be, your supermodel or something like that.
Right.
But the other side of this coin is that there is something that people can do. I mean, your lifestyle and your behaviors is in somewhat under your control, especially if you can re-engineer your environment that has obviously changed dramatically in the past 30 years to give rise to this increase in prevalence of obesity. That's the sort of two sides of this story. We know that those people who are most susceptible to increasing body weight have a huge genetic factor, but our genes have not changed in the past 30 years to drive what's now called the obesity epidemic in both the U.S. and around the world. So there's some combination of your genes and your environment that are driving increased body weight in people. We don't understand. We don't understand all of the details, but it's a fascinating story.
That makes a lot of sense because I mean, look, let's say that we accept that willpower is one component, just to entertain people who feel very strongly that hey, you can overcome any obstacle, and if you don't, it's your own fault, basically, or that hey, we have some control over our bodies. Yes, that's true, but the obesity rate has gone up in recent years by quite a lot. But yeah, our genetics haven't changed, and I would be willing to say that the stock of human willpower on Earth hasn't changed that much either. There's just as many people who are, inclined to exercise as people who are not, or people who are inclined to watch what they eat as people who are not. Probably the portion of willpower in society hasn't gone up or down. And what has changed is our environment and the foods that we're presented with and their availability and our I imagine the number of the amount we exert ourselves throughout the day as a base rate has changed as we've moved to a laptop based economy, and so those sort of large scale effects must be a large part of the story.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly something that people believe nowadays. It's one of those factors, unfortunately, that it's very hard to scientifically test that hypothesis, right? You can't just change the food supply of nations in a controlled experiment and observe, how much their body weights change. Although we do have natural experiments like the unfortunate things that happened in Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union and nowadays are happening in Venezuela. And we see that when you do change the food supply and you change the economics of these countries in such a way as to make food more difficult to obtain, yes, they don't have obesity problems. They have much worse problems, unfortunately. But I think that your hypothesis is likely to be right. It's hard to prove scientifically that these changes in our food environment and our physical activity environment have driven the obesity epidemic, and that those folks with the genes that made them most susceptible to those changes in the environment were the ones who actually became most obese.
That seems likely to me as well, but I also, I don't know how you would test it, but I think we could just I think the important part is probably just to give credence to the idea that there are environmental factors that have some sort of effect.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would argue that. It's just a question of what those factors are. Are they really, many, many individual factors that are helping drive this, or is it, maybe the food supply is the primary driver and these other factors are secondary? I tend to believe that the changes in the food supply and the food environment are driving this epidemic and worldwide basis, but I recognize that that's really a hypothesis, and it's a hypothesis that's very difficult to test.
Right. What can we say about the sort of willpower approach, right? You said that people who are genetically predisposed and are in this environment that we're all in are probably not going to be the skinniest people on Earth. I certainly makes sense to me. But it seems like there's a dichotomy here between on the one hand, it seems like progress isn't possible, and on the one hand, it seems that it is, right? I think that's the contrast that I really see here, that on the one hand, you're saying, hey, I looked at these people who are on The Biggest Loser. They worked as hard as one can work. They restricted their diets as much as possible. They exercised as much as possible. Look at them, 6 or 7 years later, they've gained most of the weight back. That, our conclusion from that should be like, man, you really can't exercise the weight off. On the other hand, I know people who have changed their bodies to some degree, right? And, sort of live to tell the tale. So what can we say in a general way about what people can expect of their own ability to change their bodies?
Right. So I think you're raising several really interesting issues. And so let me unpack it one at a time. I think that
Please.
when you look at the extreme sort of nature of the weight loss that the folks on The Biggest Loser engage in, and the huge intervention that they engage in to achieve that weight loss, some of that is driven by a desire to fit in better in society that severely stigmatizes people with obesity, the desire to look more normal. And it's perfectly reasonable for them to have those sorts of goals. But at the same time, from a medical perspective, and for folks who were genetically susceptible to this obesity to begin with, you don't need to have the huge sort of Biggest Loser style weight loss in order to achieve benefits from a health perspective. And so this sort of disconnect between people's goals and what they'd be happy with in terms of weight and the sort of societal view of people fitting into normal body size is often quite different than the health benefits. So, for example, I think that one of the interpretations of the Biggest Loser study is exactly as you said, that these people were failures, right? They had achieved somewhat of a normal body size at the end of the 7-month intensive weight loss competition, and they had regained a substantial amount of weight. However, really only about 5 or 10% body weight loss is required to have health benefits. And 6 years later, these guys were 12 to 13% on average below baseline. So they probably should be considered successes. So I think that's where you set your goalposts in terms of success is a very important factor. The other thing is you're exactly right. There are always these anecdotal stories of people going on, some diet that leads to not only weight loss over the short term, but sustained weight loss over the long term. And when we compare diets in randomized controlled trials, we often see that some diet might lead to a little bit more weight loss on average for diet A, for example, compared to diet B over the short term. And over the long term, most people seem to regain most of the lost weight, so there's no long-term difference. But within each diet, there's actually a huge amount of success stories of people who lose a lot of weight and keep it off. And there are others who don't lose any weight and might even gain weight while trying to follow exactly the same diet.
Really?
And so what we still don't understand is that just a matter of people are better at adhering to one diet over the other? To what extent might that adherence difference be driven by biology, differences in genes that are somehow interacting with the diet? Or to what extent might that difference in adherence and ability to lose weight be related to your social factors? Do you have a supportive family that's actually trying to support your diet changes? Are you in the right time and place in your life to make those changes? We don't know the answer to that question. I think that's somewhere we actually need to be moving. Some recent work had some hopes that there might be some biological driver that might be able to predict who might be most successful on one diet versus another as a function of a few different genes that had been identified in previous studies. And this was the first prospective study, and they found actually no difference between the genes. So we really don't know what generates the successes and the failures on diets. Is it some combination of biology in the diet, or is it more likely to be a combination of these other societal factors in people's diets?
That's really interesting because, I talk to, we do a lot of topics on our show and on this podcast where, everyone, we sort of have this folk notion of how something works. And then I go and I talk to an expert who says, well, actually, here's how it really works. In this case, people think, well, hey, diet and exercise can cause you to lose a lot of weight. And that's our folk notion that people who are overweight are just, not doing it correctly. And if you do it correctly, you'll lose the weight, etc. And what you're saying is we actually don't understand the mechanisms that cause some people to lose weight and some people not to on these diets.
Right. And despite the fact that, every fad diet book that's out there will tell you that, they finally discovered the key science of why what we knew in the past was wrong and why most people will be successful on the new diet. The other kinds of studies that we do here at the NIH are things like bring people in, basically study them for months at a time, where we actually don't let them leave and we feed them all of their food. And we control very carefully all the calories that they eat and how much is coming from carbs versus fat versus protein. And we really try to test some of these claims that people have been making about these various different diets. There's a very very popular claim nowadays that, if you just restrict carbs in your diet, it doesn't even matter how many calories you eat.
Right.
The hormones in your body will change in such a way that you'll burn many more calories and therefore have some advantage for weight loss. And, we've checked those kinds of claims in very controlled experiments here at the NIH Clinical Center, and they just don't hold water. So it's unfortunate because I wish we could find some magic combination of foods to eat or magic diet that we could suggest that people should eat, and that would lead to some metabolic change that would drive some advantage on average. But we haven't been able to find it so far.
Well, I'm here talking to Dr. Kevin Hall. We will be back in just a moment, so please stick around.
What the is an interview? I mean, I do not know.
That was Oscar-winning filmmaker Errol Morris. I'm Jesse Thorne, host of NPR's Bullseye. Allow me to introduce The Turnaround, a new podcast series produced by MaximumFun.org and presented with the Columbia Journalism Review. Join me as I sit down with some of our greatest living interviewers to ask them about interviewing and why and how they do what they do. We'll go deep with some of the biggest names in media, people like Larry King, Katie Couric, Audie Cornish. We'll be among friends on The Turnaround. 2 episodes a week, all summer. Subscribe now and tell somebody.
Welcome back to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I'm here talking to National Institute of Health researcher Dr. Kevin Hall. This is the sort of the area of science that so many Americans want a hard answer from more than any other. Weight loss is such a national obsession, and something that people are so crazy for answers about, and it sounds like it's one of the ones that we actually understand the least well, at least among the topics that we've covered on our show. It just, sounds like what you're telling me is there's so much more research to do on why. The idea that on some of these diets, for any given diet, some people, it works for some people and not for others, and the reasons are somewhat mysterious. That's so striking to me.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of the factors that's very difficult in this field is that it's actually very hard to measure what people eat when they're not basically confined to a study like the ones that we do here at the clinical center. So we have to rely on people's self-reports about what they eat, and we know that people can't correctly remember what they're eating, and so it's one of those.
I certainly can't.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where we have to do these very expensive but highly controlled experiments to test the effects of known diet changes on people's metabolism, their appetite, and things like that. And there just aren't that many facilities around to do that. We're fortunate to have those facilities here at the NIH, but most of the kind of research that's done is basically diet prescription research, not actual diet research, right? We prescribe a bunch of people to adhere to diet A versus diet B, but we don't really know to what extent they've actually done that. And in fact, we can calculate after the fact that it's very likely that people weren't adhering very well, at least after the first couple months, to these diets. And so it's a very difficult problem to solve. And yet people have such strong opinions about it and based on very limited data.
But by the way, I have to ask, who is signing up for these studies where they live with you and you give them all the food that they eat? First of all, it makes you sound like a very sick man. I'm sorry to say that you do this to people, but I understand it's in the name of science. But who agrees to this?
Yeah, we have a wide variety of people who volunteer for our studies. We have folks who we've had, medical residents who want to study for their board exams and don't want any outside distractions. We've had people writing business plans for startups. We've had the usual professional study subject who basically wants a place to live and free food and a payment at the end for their participation in a study. So we get a wide variety of people volunteering for our studies, and you're right. These are demanding kinds of things. We are asking people to give up weeks and potentially months of their lives to kind of work with us, and they do so. And we're very grateful for that, because I think that we've been able to debunk a lot of myths out there about diet and weight loss and metabolism, and we couldn't do it without these volunteers.
What are some of the other myths that you've been able to debunk this way?
Yeah, so I would say that one of them is this. There's been this idea out there that if you were able to cut a certain number of calories from your diet, that would lead to a very predictable and progressive weight loss, something called the 3,500 calorie per pound rule. We've been able to demonstrate that that's false, because it doesn't take into account certain physiological changes like the ones that we observed in The Biggest Loser, the fact that metabolism slows down over time, so you'll actually get progressively less and less weight loss. But that sort of myth has been out there for decades, and up until recently, dietitians were actually tested on this idea of making recommendations about how much calories people should cut to lose a certain amount of weight. And folks in policy were actually using those calculations to estimate how much weight loss in the nation would be expected for soda taxes and things like that. And we've been able to, fortunately, correct that sort of mythology with some better calculations that account for these changes in metabolism that take place. We talked about some of the myths about very low carbohydrate diets and their effects on changing energy expenditure, that is the calories that the body's burning. It's just been very interesting to sort of go step by step and take these very strong opinions and very sort of ideas that people have held for very long periods of time and put them to the test. I guess we have a sort of Kevin ruins everything attitude here about nutrition and metabolism research.
That's great. Well, the first one that you mentioned almost sounds beyond a myth to me, because it almost sounds like you're criticizing or you're debunking our a major mental model that people have for how weight works at all. I was always struck by I found on the internet at one point, it might have been on a Reddit forum or something like. Actually, this might have predated Reddit, but it was something like that. It was the engineer's guide to losing weight, and it was written by nerds for nerds, right? Who were like, well, look at your body this way. You consume a certain number of calories, and then you burn a certain number of calories, and all you have to do is calculate those numbers exactly, and then you'll burn more than you consume, and you'll lose weight as a result. Your body is a closed system, and that's all you have to do. And that always stuck with me as like, yeah, I think that's how most people think it works for the most part. But as a model, it seems like it's just fundamentally, maybe not faulty, but simplified in ways that we don't even fully understand, because the body is so complex, because you have all these knock-on effects that you're describing of metabolism changing, hormones, all of these complicated responses to stimuli that we're only beginning to understand.
Right, and just kind of full disclosure, my PhD is actually in physics, and so
really?
When I first started my lab here at the NIH, one of the things that we were doing was building sophisticated mathematical and computer simulation models of how the body responds to changes in diet, both the number of calories that you're consuming, as well as the composition in terms of carbs, fat, and protein. And so we've actually, for the first many years of my lab here at the NIH, that's kind of what we did. We basically built these models to correct these older concepts that didn't account for these dynamic changes in metabolism that occur, or these shifts in what fuels the body's using when you change the carb, fat, and protein content of the diet. And so yeah, we've developed models. There's one called the NIH Body Weight Planner that people can use to kind of go online. If you search for that, Google that, you'll find a little tool that you can use to kind of put in your goal weight and how long you want to take to reach it, and the model will spit back to you how many calories you'll have to cut from your diet and change your physical activity to reach your goal, and then perhaps more importantly, what you have to do to maintain that over time. I think that while that's all correct in theory, I think that the main difficulty is, like I alluded to before, researchers, never mind individual people kind of going about their daily life, have a very difficult time knowing how many calories they're eating.
Right.
And so even though our predictions from these kinds of models that are certainly updates and better than the old rules of thumb that people have used for a very long time, I still find them to be probably not as useful as they could be, because people don't know whether or not they're sticking to the prescriptions that those models make. So actually, we've sort of turned that around in recent years and have used tracking people's body weights over time. We did a study over a 2-year period where people were supposed to cut their calories. If we track people's body weights, can we actually estimate how many calories they've cut in their diet? And so we actually published that recently and found that we could actually do that, which is kind of exciting, because it means that, despite the fact that we've had this problem in the past, just being able to measure how many calories people are eating, we now know that if we actually track people's body weight over time, we can calculate that more accurately. And get a better picture about what's going on. That's why we know, for example, that when we do these diet prescription studies in randomized controlled trials, and we just say, okay, you guys go on diet A and you other guys go on diet B, that people lose their adherence to those prescriptions pretty readily, pretty early on.
So given that, specific diets, they work for some people, they don't work for others, we're not sure why. Super intense exercise and nutrition, in the case of The Biggest Loser, doesn't have clearly repeatable beneficial effects. Calorie counting, people aren't really able to measure their calories, etc. All of these different sort of strategies that people gravitate towards when they're thinking about their how to lose weight, none of them seem to really work effectively. Is there a general, not in terms of a specific diet or exercise plan, but is there a particular pattern that you notice in people who are able to lose any amount of weight successfully, like a certain way that they go about it, or a certain attitude that they have? Or is there, is there any sort of, broadly applicable statement that you can make about what works better than anything else?
Yeah, so, I mean, there isn't a definitive answer to that question, but people have done research investigating the success stories, right? So is there something in common about the success stories? Even the folks on The Biggest Loser, who I would consider, some of them were very successful, others less so. What describes the difference between the successes and the failures? And this is not just from our work, but from many other people's work. There seems to be some general patterns. One is that the folks who are typically successful have tended to invest a lot of effort in this process that's persistent over time. They do a lot of physical activity in terms of exercise. They tend to watch their weight more regularly, so they weigh themselves more frequently than people who are not as successful. Now, of course, that might be because the folks who are not as successful know that when they step on the scale, they might not like what they see, but that is a behavior that's common for successes. They do try to restrict calories, and fat calories in particular, and a lot of them eat breakfast, so more so than the failures. Now, again, that's not a prescription for some individual to eat a low-fat, calorie-restricted diet, exercise a lot, and eat breakfast. That's not what I'm saying, but those are the patterns of behavior that are common in people who have demonstrated success over the long term.
But there are also plenty of people, I know from my own experience, who do all those things and don't have those successes, right?
Absolutely. So, and I think that the question is, could we identify and personalize some sort of lifestyle intervention in individuals in order to maximize their success? And we don't know the answer to that question right now. What seems to be true is exactly as you said. When you look at the average and you kind of look at the average weight loss for almost any sort of lifestyle intervention that you can think of, the average follows a very typical pattern of people losing weight for a few months and sort of plateauing after around 6 months or so, and then slowly regaining the weight that they lost. And within each of those sort of average patterns, there's the successes and the failures, and we don't know right now how to, ahead of time, identify what diet, lifestyle intervention is going to be most successful for person A versus person B.
Well, I'd like to turn in the time we have left from a discussion of, the science behind what enables people to lose weight or not to a little bit more of the, social and moral dimension of the issue. Because first of all, I want to say, I realized through this conversation that we've been using the word success and failure a little bit to describe folks who lost weight or didn't. And, I want to say I don't consider anyone who has goes through one of these programs and doesn't lose weight a failure. In fact, to me, the whole point of the episode that we did and the conversation we're having now is to show that people can do everything, absolutely everything, quote, right? Everything they're told to. They can have the most willpower, they can exercise the most, and still not lose weight for what are essentially mysterious reasons that they don't truly have control over. So our conclusion after looking into that in this episode, in the episode of TV that we did, was essentially that the moral judgment that we put on ourselves and on each other, that if you don't lose weight, that it's your own fault and that it's something to be corrected in you and that you need to simply work harder, is a terrible thing to do to ourselves and to do to each other. And, we end by saying, hey, look, you should always, if you want to, try to be a little bit better tomorrow than you were today. Try to exercise a little bit more, try to eat a little bit better. You probably know what those things look like. So go ahead and do them, but remove that goal and remove that, that judgment of yourself based on whether or not you're able to achieve, whatever goal you've set. And that. Yeah, that was our conclusion. I want to know, I'm curious to know if you share it at all.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that you're right that the sort of moral aspect of this and the fact that folks who have never battled with their weight sort of view this as entirely within a person's control and it's the personal responsibility issue, negates the fact that we know about the genetic predispositions and the fact that the environment has changed so dramatically to make it even more difficult for those folks with the genetic predispositions to maintain a quote-unquote normal weight. And I think that the other aspect is that we want to dissociate some of the perhaps unrealistic goals that folks have to try to quote-unquote look normal from the health aspects of changing your behavior in a healthy way. We know that independent of weight loss, increasing your exercise and physical activity is good for your health, whether or not you lose a pound or even gain a pound of body weight. We know that eating, whole foods types of diets that are limited in processing and limited in, refined carbohydrates and saturated fat and sodium and things like that are likely to be better for you than the alternative. And so, being able to make those kinds of choices in a consistent way, as opposed to a crash diet plan or exercise plan with the primary purpose of losing weight, I think is the message that we want to get across. You should really be trying to make behavior changes that are going to be better for your health, whether or not they make any difference in terms of your body weight, and not focus solely on the scale and using the scale as the arbiter of success and failure, as we probably, in particular me, had been using it in the context of our discussion earlier.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the point for me. Is it feels to me that weight as a marker of anything needs to be we need to dramatically de-emphasize how much we use it in this discussion. I don't mean this discussion specifically. I mean in the social discussion, because people treat it almost exclusively as a proxy for health. That as though weight were the primary marker of health in a person. I have friends who have stories of going to the doctor and being told that by doctors, even that's something that they need to correct immediately, etc. The thing I take from this discussion is that we don't have direct control over our weight. We can't. It doesn't seem like we can simply change our behavior in this discrete way and get a weight change to come out immediately. We do have a control over our behaviors to some extent, but that we need to take that pressure off of ourselves to conform to a standard.
Yeah, it's a very tricky line, because on the one hand, we can say that there's a large genetic and environmental component to this problem of obesity. And there are certainly, we don't want to say, okay, well, I'm just going to be whatever weight, I'm going to end up at. I don't have to make any sort of effort to change my lifestyle to eat better or increase my physical activity or engage in healthy behaviors in some, that it's just it's destiny. There are things that people can do, and it requires persistent effort. And I think that's one of the messages of The Biggest Loser folks, is that these folks are actually successes. They continue to devote a substantial quantity of their day to exercise, and they continue to try to eat a healthy diet. It doesn't take over their entire lives. I have a colleague of mine who runs a weight loss clinic in Ottawa. And his perspective when treating his patients is to live the healthiest life that you can continue to enjoy over time. In other words, don't engage in some crash dieting program that you can't sustain just for the sole benefit of losing weight. Make healthful changes to your diet and your physical activity programs that you can sustain over time and yet still enjoy your life. Because after all, you want to maximize your enjoyment while also maximizing your health. And I think that that's an appropriate way to put things, while at the same time, society as a whole needs to recognize that there are drivers of this obesity epidemic that are probably related mostly to changes in the food system, and that there are things that we can do as a society to make our food environment a healthier one. And we need to think about that. So we shouldn't just say, oh, this is all a personal responsibility issue, as we discussed before, or that we're defeated and we can't do anything about the problem at either the individual or the society level. We have to do both. And that's what we're going to have to engage in serious discussions about that, not just here in the U.S., but around the world.
Right. And yeah, I'd agree that the important thing is making changes that you can live with. The message that we talk about on our show, I tried to build on from my own experience, where I used to be. In my 20s, I was very unhappy with how much I weighed, and I was also unhappy with my health. And so I started exercising. I started trying to eat a bit better. And for a while, I was very, very much using weight as a proxy for that, and I was like, I got to get the weight down. And I was like, I would feel shitty about myself if I didn't, if I backslid a little bit. I remember having that feeling of okay, I'll just, I'll add a mile to my, I was running a couple times a week, and I was tracking everything on a spreadsheet, how much I ran. I was like, okay, I'll add a mile and I'll try to lose some weight that way. And then I wouldn't, and I would be really frustrated, why am I not losing the weight, I ran a marathon at one point, at which point I did lose a bit of weight, not a ton. That for me was the max. Training for a marathon, I was running 6 miles 3 times a week, and then on weekends I'd go run 20 miles, and I did that for about 6 months, and I think I lost 10 pounds, 12 pounds, something like that, from what my weight had been before. And then, of course, once I stopped training for the marathon, I gained most of that back. And I was like, I think that was my max. And it still didn't bring me to a point where people would be like, oh man, that's a skinny guy over there. Despite that was the most I could ever work. And so I think that was the point at which I sort of gave up the weight fixation. And now I just sort of try to eat well and exercise for its own benefit. And I think I probably do weigh, after doing that for about, 6 or 7 years now, I think I probably do weigh 5 pounds less than I would if I didn't do those things. But I know more importantly that I sort of benefit from them in terms of my overall health. I feel better. I feel more confident. I feel like my skin is probably better or whatever, it's all of those effects, seem to me to be the most important ones. And that's why, for me personally, I feel like de-emphasizing weight as something that I'm thinking about has actually been the most helpful thing.
Right. Now, I think that your interpretation is exactly right. What I worry about is the folks who have tied their body weight to those lifestyle changes so tightly that they basically, because they don't see dramatic amounts of weight loss, they simply give up those healthful lifestyle changes.
Right.
And I think that that's probably far too common. Alternatively, people can, for short periods of time, make huge changes in their diet that are clearly not going to be sustainable. You probably can't train for a marathon every day for the rest of your life, right? That's just not that's not sustainable for most people. And so, I think that the message is exactly as you said. You can make changes in your lifestyle that will improve your health and will improve your well-being, but you have to make those changes that still make you enjoy your life, and they have to be persistent. And whether or not that leads to a huge change in weight, and for some people it might, and for some people it might not, is almost independent of whether or not you're successful keeping up those changes.
That's I couldn't imagine a more succinct way to put it, and I really appreciate you putting it that way. And I appreciate you coming on the show to talk to us about this, Kevin. It's been really really enlightening. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you so much again, Kevin, for coming on the show. And that is it for Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. We will be back in 2 weeks, so please tune in then. Our producer is Shara Morris. And if you like the show, please be sure to tell a friend about our podcast and subscribe to us on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to leave us a rating or comment wherever you subscribe. That would really help us out a lot. And once again, Adam Ruins Everything is back with all new episodes Tuesdays at 10 on True TV, or you can find clips and full episodes at truetv.com/AdamRuinsEverything and the Watch True TV app. Until then, that's it for us today. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
MaximumFun.org.
Comedy and culture.
Artist owned.
Listener supported.